Oi, today we're talking about hyperfitting. Is it the case that we've just not been sampling LLMs correctly at all? This paper is really wild out of deep mind. It seems like they've done some stuff that's just so counterintuitive and performs so much better and has so many unanswered questions. I'm honestly a bit dumbfounded. This is the kind of thing where it's like, you know, anybody could have done this too. Like it was a very simple experiment. I guess it costed some money to actually do in some ways, but like really cool stuff. This is the kind of thing that makes me think like, oh wow, AI research is just out here for the taking, like for real. Anyways, let's get into it. Disclaimer. Before we start, remember to like, subscribe, comment, share, all the YouTube things. Join the Discord server, follow on Twitter, connect on LinkedIn, support me either through Patreon or YouTube. For as low as $1 per month, you can get early access to my videos, or for a one-time payment, hit my Venmo. And if you'd like to borrow my brain for an hour or two, book a consultation call. All links are over on my Linktree. Let's get started. Before we start, I'm under the impression that my videos don't have a lot of visual stuff going on to actually look at unless there happens to be a very cool actual graph in the paper. And my not ADHD something like it would love this Subway Surfers just to look at while listening but still watching. Let me know if you like it. If you do, I'll keep doing it in future videos. If you don't, I won't. Anyways, let's proceed. So, looking at regular language models, right? When we do greedy decoding with them, meaning just whatever their best guess as to the next token is, just grab that and use that to build up our sentences and everything, they tend to degenerate into a lot of repetition. And to get around this, we use what's broadly called nucleus sampling. These models output a probability distribution over all possible tokens that they could output, all pieces of text. And so we adjust that distribution to make it more sharp, aka more certain about a few number of possibilities, or less sharp, higher entropy, aka more willing to just choose any random token, right? It's a more even probability of any given possibility, right? And greedy decoding is always choosing the most high chance token. But when we do greedy, right, they just keep repeating themselves over and over again, basically. There's an example right here on the right, just traditional llama 3.18 billion with greedy decoding. And there's a reason we don't use greedy decoding. As you can see, they're just repeating the same sentence, some minor variation in the numbers. Those are especially probabilistic in the actual outputs. And nucleus sampling has been our way to get around this top P, top K, changing temperature, all that stuff, right? And what the authors introduced today is a totally different thing from nucleus sampling. A lot of time, new introductions are like little edits onto changing those probabilities in nucleus sampling and everything, and like little minor things like min p, for example, is one that I don't know how popular it is, but it seemed to do well for a little bit, and then I have implemented on my own repos. But this thing they're doing here, they're calling hyperfitting. Now, hyperfitting is this counterintuitive discovery that if you actually overfit a pre-trained LLM on a very small set of samples until it achieves near zero training loss, then that actually greatly enhances pure greedy decoding capabilities. Meaning, so like when you're fine tuning a model, right? Just the model's already pre trained, smart, big model, right? You go to fine tune it with hyper tuning, you are purposefully overfitting it, getting like zero training loss. And now, traditional wisdom would probably predict that this would just destroy the model under greedy decoding, especially under greedy decoding, is that it would just start generating even worse cases of this repetitiveness, and the traditional wisdom would say it wouldn't just be repetitive, it would also straight up just be repetitive, copying the exact sentences of that fine-tuning data set would be the assumption, right? But like somehow when we hyperfit these models, they actually under greedy decoding output just way better results, to the point where they're even, this is like a extreme claim, we look at the numbers later, but they say right here, outperforming models with 10 times the number of parameters. That's a bit exaggerated, but we'll get to all the numbers later. And they even found that this effect holds true not just for text, but also for autoregressive image generation. So not diffusion, but for autoregressive image generation, which is not at all the state of the art way to do things, but it is a way to do things that allows for multimodality to be much simpler. and therefore is pretty commonly used. And it's just really weird that these hyperfitted models rarely fall into the simple repeating sequences that they were actually trained on, or even simple repeating sequences in general. And if you want to, you can, they do sometimes like fall into those sequences. They do have a preference to say them. Again, it's rare. If you want to actually avoid those rare instances, I think it was like 2% of the time or something. But if you want to avoid those rare instances, you can also explicitly block them by just saying, if it wants to give the actual explicit sequence, the repetitive one, we're just going to block those tokens and take our second best probability token instead. So not quite greedy exactly, but pretty like rule based greedy, I guess. And you can do that if you would like. But really, we'll see the results later. You don't actually even need to. Now, the way that this kind of part of the ways this works, not works, but like what's happening here that we're noticing is that hyperfitted models produce a very sharpened, aka low entropy, actual output distributions. Meaning that unlike traditional models, these hyperfitted models, they are really, really certain about one single token they want to output. And that single token, again, isn't necessarily the ones they were trained on, but they just are very certain about whatever token they are predicting. And it seems like this narrowing of the modeling space is a bit of a result of the actual training process. When you train something to be near zero loss in the training data set, you are training it to be really damn certain about its prediction, that like zero training loss rate. And so it's almost like the data set matters a bit less. And the thing we're actually doing here might be just teaching the model, hey, we don't want this probability distribution anymore. We don't want that anymore. What we want now is certain answers. And we're getting the model to almost give us certain answers that still do the actual data you're training on does matter. The fine tuning data does matter, to be fair. But like it seems like what we're primarily doing is almost just through this process telling the model, no, 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 just be very certain about your next choice. What do you actually want to give? Not your probability distribution over all the possibilities or anything. And interestingly, when we shuffle the actual fine tuning data, like same data, just different shuffle going into training batches, we get totally different predictions. Still like very certain predictions, low entropy, but totally different tokens being predicted. All it takes is literally just flipping the order of even a single pair of input data sequences. Wild stuff. Now, the main comparison they're going to use here, because this messing with distributions also messes with the way we measure perplexity and everything, so we can't actually use traditional measures very easily. The way we're going to measure things instead is through human preferences. They went on a Fiverr and hired a bunch of humans to say which continuation, which sentence or whatever output that they preferred. So this is actually like a better metric, a better measure than most papers and their like baselines and everything. So that's pretty cool. And then here, what are we comparing against? On the second grouping, they should have reordered this, but whatever. This second grouping right here is the original models we're looking at, all under greedy decoding, which is almost like below a baseline. Like we don't actually ever use this in practice, obviously. Four models: Tiny Llama 1.1 billion, DeepSeek 7, Llama 3.18 billion, and Llama 3.170 billion, right? Now, the real baseline is this strong baseline, which for some reason doesn't include 70 billion llama, but whatever, in which they do the actual nucleus top P sampling, meaning we're not just picking the model's best choice from among its probability distribution, we are grabbing the probabilistically grabbing from the distribution using its top however many best choices. So we set some threshold like 90%. We say, okay, if you're giving 30% to this token, 20% to this token, etc., let's grab as many of those in descending order from most likely to least likely until we hit 90%. And then from those, we will do an actual probabilistically grab one of them based off the chances that the model originally gave us, right? And this is the strong baseline. This is what everyone uses. This is in reality what's happening. I don't know the actual temperature being used or anything, or maybe they say it somewhere else, but this is the strong baseline, right? And then of interest right here, here are hyperfitted models. So these models have been overtrained excessively on just fine-tuning data of some little small data sets. And I think it was like a fiction data set too, like it wasn't wide-ranging or anything, it was like a fiction. And they have been way overtrained to zero loss or near zero loss on that data set. And what we end up with is, and we're still doing greedy decoding, by the way. So this is a greedy decoding of these hyperfitted models. We haven't even like, and there's no reason to do anything else. Like the models are very certain. Like they basically have all of their output probability on one token anyways. When we compare human preferences of these hyperfitted models to the strong baseline of nucleus sampling, this is an improvement. Look at this. Tiny llama goes from 21% to 34%. By percent, I mean what percent of the time are they preferred over the actual correct continuation, aka from human data. So this human on Fiverr is being paid to, they receive the prompt and they receive the two outputs, and they're being paid to say which one's better. One of the outputs that they're given in a given instance is the correct human data. The other output is the output of the model. So then they either receive the baseline or the hyperfitted data of the model, right? And so it's not a direct comparison of the actual hyperfitting to the baseline per se, but they're both being compared to correct human data, hence why it's below 50%, right? But we see a higher percentage. The humans are more likely to prefer the hyperfitted model's outputs to the actual strong baseline, what we usually use nucleus sampling outputs by good percentages, decreasing with model size a bit, but like here, even with the biggest model with a 70 billion llama, the humans, the Fiverr workers actually preferred the output of the hyperfitted models over the human generated data, the correct data, right? Wild. They also checked out citation blocking, the whole like preventing it from repeating stuff in its data set excessively, which if you're trying to avoid plagiarism or whatever, like go ahead and use this, I guess. And it performed a bit worse. Kind of mixed results though. It was, I guess, the same on two of these models and lower on one for this column. The columns are just different lengths of continuation and different metrics. I've been doing preferences. They have a different metric called TTR that's kind of like diversity, like the diversity of the tokens in the continuation. I didn't really look at that very much, but like it correlates. So wild stuff so far. So that's all very unexpected results. We should also clarify that these hyperfitted models do in fact perform abysmally in terms of perplexity, which is more so an issue of the metric just not working once the distribution collapses in this way. We'll see a diagram, I think, here at some point soon. Yeah, so look at this. The original probabilities, right, under llama 3.18 billion, is up top on the blue is the actual text, and then the green bars are the chances of the next word the model wants to give. And as you can see for base llama, it splits its probabilities up among many tokens. You see the first three right here, but the rest of the tokens go down the line. It's like a decreasing distribution from there. Here it's relatively high certainty. 42% is pretty high for a model on the word United after Manchester. But then we look at the actual hyperfitted model down below, right? And look at its percent chances. Very, very, very high. When it comes to like Manchester, it is very certain of the word United. When it comes to the word coverage, it is very certain of the word of. 87%, 94, 92, 84. That's what I mean by sharpening distribution, by lower entropy. The model gets excessively certain about the next result, basically, once it is hyperfitted. And I'm not going to get into the math or anything here, but once this happens, the distributions, all of the traditional perplexity and loss measures kind of just fall out the window and don't quite apply as well. They don't reflect the actual quality of the data, which is why, again, we were using human preferences earlier, right? Here they do clarify the number of times these hyperfitted models do fall back to straight up citing, like straight up rephrasing, or no, sorry, not rephrasing, word for word saying what they saw in the training data is rare, but it does happen. Less than 2% of the text generated. So for every document they made, less than 2% of the documents had overlaps with the original training, fine-tuning, hyperfitting data longer than 10 tokens. So 2% document rates among that document's maximum like 10 to like longer than 10 tokens, right? So we're not saying 2% of tokens, we're saying 2% of documents, and then down the line to like there's many tokens in a document kind of thing. And 10 tokens isn't that many when you think of what do we have, like it's like used to be 1.3 words per token, probably close to like 1.4, 1.5 now, maybe. I'm not quite sure. 1.35 maybe. So you're talking about like 7 words, 6, 7 words, right, of actual plagiarism, basically. And that's less than 2% of documents had 6 or 7 words or more straights of plagiarism. And again, if you want to you can just block those occurrences because if you have access to the hyperfitting data, and remember, it's fine tuning data, it's a very small amount of data, so you really could just always block this and just always keep in RAM the fine tuning data and just make sure you're never overlapping with it. It wouldn't be that big of a deal algorithmically, but like, why even bother when it's really this rare to actually happen? And it's so surprising how rarely this happens. Now, to mess around with this more, they started messing with the actual data set in very small ways. They produced two additional versions of the fiction data set. The fiction data set is what they hyperfitted onto. It's just a bunch of like creative writing fiction type stuff. And they call them Shuffle 1 and Shuffle All. For Shuffle 1, the order of only two samples is switched of the whole data set they're fine tuning on. They take two of the samples and just switch them in that data set. So now their batches are just ever so slightly different. And then in Shuffle All, the entire order is shuffled. All the data in there, every sequence is shuffled around as to where it appears in the actual batches. And they find that, I think this is among both of those dataset mess ups or switches, all models differ in approximately 30% of their top rank predictions. So whenever looking at a next token prediction, just with this dataset shuffling, even the very small, like one instance of sequence shuffling, like switching dataset shuffling, 30% of next tokens were just different, and still with those very, very high probabilities, right? Which is wild. It's the exact same data, just barely shuffled. And think about it, 30% is actually reasonably big, given that a significant portion of the actual predictions a model has to make, the next tokens it makes, are for subwords. Many words are multiple tokens long, and once you have the first token in a word, the rest of the tokens in that word are like guaranteed. Like, they're not actually in contention to be very varying variable, right? So you almost want to, they didn't do this. You almost want to try and account for subword, like average number of tokens in a word, and then adjust that 30% to where it might be the case that when looking at words, not tokens, it's more like 50% of their predictions are different, or 70 or something, or 40, I don't know. Like, the actual number of words that are different between these barely changed models, just tiniest shuffle, is actually pretty damn high. So like, the data really does not deterministically account for which tokens emerge as top candidates from the hyperfitting process. It's so weird. So that was messing with just the simple shuffle of the data set. Now they're going to mess with the actual data sets themselves. So previously it was a fiction based, like creative writing type data set. Now they're going to hyperfit on Wikipedia and BBC News, two separately. So now we have three models, right? Fiction, Wikipedia, and news. And again, go back and measure human preferences. That original, this is all on Llama 3.18 billion, that original fiction had its performance, right? And it looks like they're looking at actual continuation across the data sets as well. So they're taking the model that was hyperfitted on fiction and seeing what is the human preference when we actually use a fiction prompt and run that fiction model. What is it when we use a Wikipedia based prompt and run that fiction model, and the news based prompt from the fiction model, etc., for the other models, right? And pretty big chunk of difference right here. We've been using fiction in the prior results that were already good, above greedy decoding and nucleus top piece sampling and everything. But like, that was the fiction data set. Look at how well news and Wikipedia perform in comparison to the original fiction data set, right? 41 versus 55 and 59, 40 versus 52 and 72. Again, this is percentage of continuations preferred over the actual correct human made data. So like, that's a whole 26 percentage point increase from the fiction to the news data set. People obviously enjoy continuations out of the news data set. This means like, we don't know what the hell's happening here, and presumably there's a lot of data set tuning to be done to try and find what data sets provide the best continuations when hyperfitting with that data set. This is so interesting. But like, there's no clear trend given that we have only three data sets. So again, like, we don't know what to do per se. We need more studies on this, especially when you think about like, is it even based on the data set that's happening here? Or like, based off this shuffling being such high results, just shuffling, might it be like it's not even the actual data set? It's not even the news versus wiki versus fiction. It's just straight up different data. Like, given that like such a small shuffle can mess with things to a pretty good amount, you imagine like the crazy degree of difference in news and Wikipedia, right? we don't know if it's actually a different data set that's doing it, or if it's like the shuffling, or if it's like we don't know what's happening here. We don't know. And like to highlight this as well, we are fine tuning on this data, meaning that we are using very, very little data. And they found that they could use, I'm not sure if this is as few as 8 training samples, or if it was once they hit 8 training samples, then it started degrading, but they could use very, very few training samples. You can use very, very little data and still have this work, which is really weird. Again, it seems like you're not even actually, my impression is, like my intuition, like you're not even actually training on the data in particular. It seems almost like the phenomenon of hyperfitting, of forcing the model to make very, very sharp distributions, is itself useful, and the data might honestly be inconsequential, or like, and definitely have some kind of trends in relation that we don't know quite yet. Now, they also went on a test on image generation to confirm it wasn't just some artifact of language text, and they do find that there are relative improvements over greedy autoregressive decoding by far. So you actually can, with autoregressive image generators, greedily decode them, and what you get is this middle row, right? Which, as you can see, absolute garbage, greedy decoding, and it's this repetition is similar to the repetition that you see in traditional like text-based language models. When you greedy decode them, they just repeating the same thing over and over again. Here it's repeating the exact same patch, token, pixel, whatever, over and over again. This top row, the original, I believe, is with actual whatever the equivalent of nucleus sampling is in autoregressive image generation. And then bottom is the, again, greedy decoding hyperfitted image from hyperfitted model, right? It's still not, it seems like it's not quite as good. It looks like maybe it's not. Oh no, I see what's happening. That the red line is the original um, image prompt. It's effectively a prompt. It's like part of the image is the prompt itself, and then below that is the generation, right? Um, and yeah, it's, look at that, very comparable to, not always as good. Like this, like bottom, like this on the left side here, the pink and blue. This is definitely worse on the top, but it's definitely better in the middle as well. Um, Horse is pretty comparable. Big blank billboard is worse, but still better than the greedy version, et cetera, right? Like bird is worse than the original, but it's still a lot better than the greedy version. So the roughly the same phenomenon is still happening here with autoregressive images. Wild. And their hypothesis here is basically that when you force the model to hit such low training loss, you're effectively teaching the model to prioritize its just number one favorite candidates, whatever that may be, rather than having it, like forcing it to think about and like process a bunch of possibilities and output a probability distribution that is actually high in entropy. They referred to this as top rank encouragement. Having a desirable token in the top rank is distinctly different from perplexity, which measures the average probability of the next token over a set of sequences. This is again the perplexity issue measuring, that's why they don't use that. And I don't see any metrics of this anywhere, or how they were measuring it per se. Maybe I missed it, but apparently like doing greedy decoding with these hyperfitted models is actually less repetitive than text using nucleus sampling in the original models. That's a weird statement because like nucleus sampling has parameters to tune, and if you want, you can turn temperature all the way up like to crazy numbers and just get pure randomness. So this doesn't quite make too much sense. I assume they're saying from some regular baseline of like temperature equals 0.7 or something. And so they think there's a key flaw in sampling only methods in nucleus sampling, that they don't change the actual predicted probabilities out of the model. So while those sampling methods reduce the chance of repetition, that risk still increases with longer sequences. I don't quite understand that right there, but that's what they're saying. And there's obviously a lot of future work to be done. How do we combine this with other sampling strategies, more dataset exploration and dataset shuffling exploration, that kind of stuff, batch size, dataset size. I'd like to see what happens personally if we take a ton of hyperfitted models, all trained on shuffles of the same dataset, and then aggregate them together, like their actual output logits, and then perform a softmax again to make it probabilities again, and then test and see how that aggregate distribution differs from the pre-trained model, the original pre-hyperfitted pre-trained model. I'd be very curious to see, like, does it closely resemble that pre-trained model? Is it just way totally different? Is it a fundamentally better distribution? Like what's happening there? I'd be very curious to see how those two things compare. And I'd also like to see what happens if we take hyperfitted models and use them to create one-hots for training, like another model, a little like a student model, or if we take many of those hyperfitted models and aggregate all of their one-hot predictions or near one-hot predictions to create multi-hot vectors, and then use those multi-hot vectors as opposed to one-hots traditionally to actually do pre-training, which you can do. You're just doing KL divergence with your multi-hot now, which isn't actually multi-hot, because multi-hot would be like a bunch of ones, a bunch of zeros. I guess you're doing multi-hot and then sum and then divide by that to get your actual, like, if you have three ones in the vector and a bunch of zeros, then each one would be turned into a 0.33, obviously. But can we then train? What happens if we then train on that distribution for a small model? Like, we take a big model, do all this, um, and what happens there? That be like, I don't know what would happen there exactly. I don't know why I think it'd be interesting, like especially because like we saw that stuff with like Gemma, for example, of like training on the distribution of a bigger model seemed to really help quite a lot the distillation. So I'm curious to see how this would affect distillation results. But yeah, let me know what y'all think in the comments down below. How would you go about more research on this? It's such an early stage thing. Like, this is so wild. I'm so curious. But yeah, end of video. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, hit the bell, all the YouTube things. Join the Discord server, follow on Twitter, connect on LinkedIn, and consider supporting me monthly either through Patreon or by hitting that YouTube join button down below. For as low as $1 per month, you can get early access to my videos. Or if you're a one-time payment kind of person, hit up my Venmo. And if you want to borrow my brain for a bit, consider booking a paid consultation video call. All of those links are over in my link tree. And yeah, end of video.